There are restaurants in this city where the waiting list is longer than most people's engagements, where the sommelier earns more than a public school teacher, and where the unspoken rule is that the staff exists to be invisible. Haven and Hart was that kind of place. Tucked into the ground floor of a converted Beaux-Arts building in the West Loop, it had 16 tables, no printed menu, and a reservation system that operated like a private members club, except the membership was never explicitly stated. You either knew someone who knew someone, or you didn't eat there. Sloane Mercer had worked the floor at Haven and Hart for 3 years. She was 29, dark-haired, with the kind of still, watchful eyes that made guests feel simultaneously seen and comfortable. She moved through the dining room the way experienced servers always do, efficiently, without urgency, never rushing but never idle. The regulars asked for her by name, even the difficult ones. She had a system. Before each service, she reviewed the reservation notes left by the host, cross-referenced the names against her own mental file of preferences, allergies, anniversaries, and personal idiosyncrasies she had accumulated over 3 years. Table 4 preferred the bread without rosemary. The gentleman at 12 always ordered the same wine, but needed to be allowed the ritual of deliberating. The woman who came every Thursday evening, always alone, always with a novel, did not want to be asked how the food was. She wanted to be left in peace. Sloane knew all of this the way a musician knows a score. Not by thinking about it, but by having absorbed it so completely that it simply operated. What the guests did not know, because it was not their business to know, was that Sloane had begun her career somewhere else entirely. She had spent 2 years in a doctoral program in biochemistry at Northwestern before her mother's diagnosis. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3, caught late because her mother had put off the doctor for 8 months due to a gap in insurance coverage. The kind of story that is not unusual in America, which is perhaps the most troubling thing about it. Sloane had withdrawn from the program in November of her 2nd year. She had been 3 months into a research fellowship that her advisor had called the kind of opportunity that comes once, maybe twice, in a career. She had packed a box, shaken hands with her labmates, and driven to St. Louis to sit with her mother through the first round of chemo. She did not speak about this at work. It was not relevant, and she was not the kind of person who performed her suffering for sympathy. She had found the job at Haven and Hart 6 months after returning to Chicago, when the bills were stabilizing but not resolved, and the income from her previous position at a neighborhood bistro had not been enough. The restaurant paid well. The tips at this level were exceptional. She was good at the job, and she understood, in the way that genuinely intelligent people often do, that being good at one thing does not preclude having been good at something else entirely. It was a Wednesday in March when Prescott Aldgate walked in. He arrived at 7:15, 15 minutes before his reservation, with 2 men in his wake who had the particular look of people whose entire professional identity consisted of being near someone important. Sloane noticed him immediately, not because he was loud, not yet, but because of the way he moved. There is a specific kind of man who walks into rooms as though the room has been waiting for him, and Aldgate was that kind of man. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the deep tan of someone who split their time between continents, silver hair worn short, and a sport coat that probably cost more than Sloane's monthly rent. He scanned the room in one smooth motion, the way people do when they are calculating the social weight of everyone present, and then he smiled at nothing in particular, satisfied with what he found. He had made his money in logistics software. 12 years ago, his company had built the routing infrastructure that quietly ran beneath 1/3 of North American freight operations. He had sold it, bought it back at a lower valuation when the market turned, restructured, and sold it again at a profit that had been written about in the journal with the kind of reverence usually reserved for military campaigns. Since then, he had become what the financial press called an operator, and what everyone else called a man who enjoyed owning things. He sat on 4 boards, 2 of which he had installed himself, and he had a reputation in certain Chicago circles, among junior associates, restaurant staff, hotel concierges, and anyone else who served him in any capacity, that did not appear in his press coverage. Sloane brought the menus. At Haven and Hart, the menus were handwritten each evening on a single card, 7 courses, with 2 alternatives offered at the 3rd and 5th. She set them down with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times, introduced herself, and asked about water preferences. Aldgate did not look up. She waited. This was also something she had learned, not to fill silence with nerves, not to repeat herself. She simply waited. "Still," said one of the men beside Aldgate. The other nodded. Aldgate finally looked at her. He had the particular kind of eye contact that was not really eye contact. The gaze of a person who is looking at you while seeing something they have already categorized and filed. "I'd like something off menu," he said. "Of course," Sloane said. "I'm happy to speak with the kitchen. Do you have something specific in mind, or would you like me to describe what's available this evening?" "I don't want a description." He picked up the menu card and set it back down without reading it. "Tell the chef I want the seared duck breast, medium, with a cherry reduction and no fennel. Simple." Sloane noted it without writing it down. Another thing she had learned, because some guests interpreted the notepad as an indication that you were not paying attention. She said she would check with the kitchen and returned in 4 minutes with confirmation. She brought the bread. She brought the amuse-bouche. She checked in at the appropriate intervals without hovering. The first hour was unremarkable. It was during the 3rd course, a halibut with a white miso broth that the chef had been refining for 2 months, that Aldgate's mood shifted. His phone had buzzed twice in quick succession, and whatever he'd read had closed at something behind his eyes. When Sloane arrived to clear the plates, he looked at her differently. Not more attentively. Differently. "You know what this is?" He pointed at the remnants of the broth. "The broth is a white miso base with dashi and a small amount of yuzu," she said. "The chef uses a specific miso that's fermented longer than standard. It's closer to a Kyoto-style shiro, though he doesn't advertise that." Aldgate stared at her for a moment. Then he said, in what she would later describe to her mother as a voice that expected applause, "Eiga reikoku ni wa donna kibun desu ka?" The 2 men beside him exchanged a glance. One of them suppressed a smile. The sentence was Japanese. Roughly translated, "What does it feel like to be in a cold, heartless movie?" It was an odd construction. Not a natural phrase, but the kind of thing someone assembles from a phrase book with the specific intention of being incomprehensible. The implication was clear. He expected her to stand there blankly, to confirm in front of his associates that she was exactly what he had already decided she was. A pleasant-faced woman in a uniform whose entire world was contained within this dining room. Sloane looked at him for exactly as long as it takes to let someone understand that they have been heard. Then she said, quietly and without particular emphasis, "Sono eiga no nakade watashi wa kankyaku yorimo oku no koto o shitte iru to omoimasu." In that movie, I think I know more than the audience. The smile dropped off the face of the man to Aldgate's left. Aldgate himself went very still. "You speak Japanese," he said. It was not a question. "My mother's family is from Kyoto," she said. "She taught me to read before she taught me to read English." This was true. Sloane's maternal grandmother had come to the United States in the 1970s, had never fully released the language, and had raised Sloane's mother in a household that moved between both. "Is there anything I can bring you?" She brought the fourth course. She did not linger. At the next table, a couple celebrating their anniversary were speaking quietly about a film they'd seen. Sloane attended to them, took a dessert order from a table near the window, and checked in with the kitchen about a modification for a guest with a shellfish allergy. She was aware, with the peripheral attention that long service develops, that Aldgate's table had gone quieter than before. When she returned to clear the fourth course, Aldgate looked up at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Where did you go to school?" he asked. "Northwestern," she said. "For what?" This was, technically, not appropriate dinner conversation, and she was under no obligation to answer. But she had learned, in 3 years at Haven and Hart, that there is a version of answering that gives nothing away while still being an answer. "Biochemistry," she said, and then, before he could ask the obvious follow-up, "Can I tell you about the fifth course?" Aldgate sat back. There was something working behind his eyes that Sloane could not entirely read, which was unusual. She could usually read them. He had come in carrying a deal that was, as of this evening, in some jeopardy. The logistics of it were complex, but the center of it was this. Aldgate had been pursuing an acquisition of a mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution company called Verano Systems. The acquisition was structured around a proprietary cold chain tracking method that Verano had developed, a system for monitoring temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical shipments at every point in the supply chain, in real time, with a margin of error that was, by industry standards, exceptionally low. Aldgate wanted it, not because he understood the science, but because he understood that whoever controlled pharmaceutical cold chain logistics in the next decade would have leverage in a market that was only going to grow. The problem was that 2 of Verano's senior researchers had resigned in the last quarter, citing disagreements with the incoming management structure, and the acquiring team's due diligence had turned up a question about the underlying patent that had not been satisfactorily resolved. Aldgate's legal team had passed it to 3 external consultants. All 3 had given him different answers. None of this was Sloane's concern. She brought the 5th course, a lamb with a preserved lemon and olive salsa verde that was by most accounts the best dish on the current menu, and explained it briefly. She refilled the water. She moved on. It was the larger man to Aldgate's right, a man named Burrows. She thought she'd heard. Who said something, leaning toward Aldgate in the way that people lean when they think they're being discreet in a room where the acoustics are better than they expect. She caught the phrase, "the patent issue," and Harwick's red. She was already past the table, already at the service station. She thought nothing of it. What she did not know, and what she had no reason to know, was that among the other guests at Haven and Hart, that Wednesday evening was a woman named Dr. Cecile Fontaine. Dr. Fontaine was 61, small, with the compact, deliberate manner of someone who was accustomed to being underestimated. She had spent 30 years in pharmaceutical patent law. She was, by the assessment of everyone in the field who was not her opponent, among the best in the country. She had been at Haven and Hart that evening for what she'd told herself was a quiet dinner alone. She did it once a month, reserved the corner table, ordered without the tasting menu, and sat with a glass of wine and her own thoughts. She had developed this habit after her divorce 15 years ago, and had found it so restorative that she had never given it up. She had arrived at 7 and had been quietly present for everything. When Aldgate's voice had risen slightly, around the 3rd course, she had glanced over. She had recognized him. Not personally, but professionally. She had seen his name on filings. She had, in fact, been consulted by one of the 3 external firms that his team had retained, though her specific involvement had been limited to a preliminary review that she had declined to take further. Sloane was presenting the pre-dessert, a small blood orange sorbet with a dusting of Aleppo pepper, the kind of palate cleanser that only made sense once you'd tasted it, when Aldgate put his hand up. Not rudely, exactly. The way people put their hand up when they are accustomed to having it obeyed. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "Cold chain," he said. "Pharmaceutical. Do you know what that is?" It was a test. She could see it plainly. He was looking at her the way people look when they are deciding whether to be impressed or dismissive, and she understood that, for him, these were the only 2 available options. She had known men like this her entire adult life. Her doctoral advisor had been one, in a different register. Her mother's first oncologist had been another. A temperature-controlled supply chain management for pharmaceuticals, she said. The critical window for most biologics is between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius. The margin requirements for things like mRNA-based therapeutics are tighter. Some need to stay within a half-degree variance for the full transit. The tracking technology is the hard part. GPS plus ambient sensor arrays, real-time logging, chain of custody documentation. The patent disputes in that space usually come down to sensor calibration methods and data transmission protocols. She paused. "Is there something I can help you with, or is this a general question?" The silence at the table was complete. Aldgate looked at her for a long time. The man named Burroughs had set down his fork. The other man was staring at the tablecloth with the careful attention of someone who has decided not to have an expression. "How do you know that?" Aldgate said. "I spent 2 years doing biopharmaceutical research," she said, "specifically in protein stability under thermal stress. The cold chain infrastructure is something my lab worked adjacent to, at Northwestern." "Yes." He leaned back. He was not a man who showed discomfort easily, but there was something in the set of his jaw that had shifted. "Why are you serving tables?" It was a rude question. She had heard versions of it before. People always thought it was a compliment. What they meant was, "You seem too good for this." But what it actually communicated was, "This job has no value." She had decided years ago not to be offended by it, because the people who asked it were not trying to be cruel. They were simply broadcasting their own hierarchy without realizing it. "I'm very good at this job," she said simply. "Can I bring anything else before dessert?" She walked back toward the service station. She was aware that Aldgate was watching her go. In the corner, Dr. Fontaine had caught the exchange. Not all of it, but enough. She had excellent hearing and had never been particularly interested in pretending otherwise. She signaled Sloane when she passed. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Would you tell me your name?" "Sloane." Dr. Fontaine studied her for a moment. "Are you the server who was just discussing pharmaceutical cold chain tracking with that table?" "I was. In your previous life," Dr. Fontaine said, and there was something in the phrase that was not unkind, but was very precise. "What specifically were you working on?" Sloane glanced at the room. She had 3 other tables to attend to, but there was something about the woman's manner, the directness of it, the complete absence of theater, that made her answer honestly. Protein aggregation in thermally stressed environments, mostly concerned with why certain monoclonal antibody formulations degrade faster than theoretical models predict when you introduce microfluctuations in storage temperature. Dr. Fontaine's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "Who was your advisor?" she asked. Sloane told her. Dr. Fontaine nodded once, slowly. "I know his work. He published a paper in 2019 that was used as a central reference in 3 separate patent cases I handled." She picked up her wine glass and then set it down without drinking. "I have a question for you, hypothetically. If a cold chain tracking system's patent claim rests on a specific sensor calibration algorithm, and the question is whether that algorithm constitutes a novel method or a non-obvious variation on existing prior art, what would you need to look at?" "The filing date," Sloane said immediately, "and the prior art cited. If they cited their own earlier work, but not the competing work published within the same year, you have a disclosure issue. And if the calibration method uses a Kalman filter variation, which most of them do now, you need to look at whether they claimed the filter itself or just the application, because the filter's been in use in aerospace since the 60s. "Doctor." Fontaine looked at her for a moment that went on long enough to be noticeable. "Sit down," she said. Sloane glanced at her tables. "I'll wait," Dr. Fontaine said. She covered her tables, checked with the floor manager, and took a 10-minute break. She sat across from Dr. Fontaine in the corner of the dining room, in the low amber light, and they spoke for 9 minutes about patent law, thermal stress research, and the specific gap in pharmaceutical logistics expertise that, according to Dr. Fontaine, 3 of her current clients would very much like to fill. Across the room, Prescott Aldgate was watching this with the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of a very long calculation and found the answer to be something he did not expect. He did not know who the woman in the corner was. He did not know what they were discussing. He knew only that the server, who had answered him in Japanese, who had described pharmaceutical cold chain mechanics with the fluency of a researcher, was sitting across from another guest and speaking with a focus and a stillness that he recognized as the body language of professional equals. Burroughs leaned in. "That woman in the corner is Dr. Fontaine," he said quietly. "Cecil Fontaine. She's the one we couldn't get to consult on the patent question." "She declined." Aldgate said nothing. "She's consulting with your server," Burroughs said. The dessert came and went. Sloane presented it without particular ceremony, thanked the table, and did not meet Aldgate's eyes. When she brought the check, he had already signed it. She noticed, without reaction, that the tip was not what it might have been. What happened in the 2 weeks that followed was not something Sloane witnessed directly. She learned it in pieces from Dr. Fontaine, who called the restaurant the following Friday and asked to speak with her. From a brief item she found herself reading online, almost by accident, about a deal that had collapsed due to unresolved patent concerns. Aldgate's acquisition of Verano Systems had fallen through. The due diligence team had been unable to resolve the patent question before the exclusivity window closed, and the Lessessers, no longer confident in the acquirer's ability to close cleanly, had accepted a competing offer. The competing offer was for a lower number, but it came with fewer complications. The financial press covered it in 2 paragraphs. By those metrics, it was not a significant story, but people who followed Aldgate's career more closely understood what it meant, that he had overextended on a deal in a technical domain he did not fully understand, had failed to secure the right expertise in time, and had lost. None of that was Sloane's doing. She had answered questions honestly. She had done her job. The rest of it was the natural consequence of a man who had spent years surrounding himself with people who confirmed what he already believed, operating in a field complex enough that confirmation was not enough. Dr. Fontaine, in their second conversation, was direct. Her firm had a research consulting practice, a small team that supported litigation work with technical analysis. She had an opening. It was not a full-time position yet, but it was structured to become one. The compensation, even part-time, was more than Haven and Hart. The work was exactly adjacent to what Sloane had been trained to do. "I want to be honest with you," Dr. Fontaine said. I'm not offering this because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because you're precise. You're fast, and you understand how to explain complex things without losing the complexity. Those are not common qualities. Sloane had told her mother that evening, sitting in the apartment in Pilsen that they had shared since the move back from St. Louis. Her mother was in remission, had been for 18 months, and was working part-time again at the school where she had taught 3rd grade for 16 years before the diagnosis. She had listened to Sloane's account with the careful attention she brought to everything, and then she had said, in the dry way that was entirely her, "I want to hear more about the Japanese." Sloane had laughed. He thought it would embarrass me. And it turned out he'd picked the wrong language to try it in. Her mother had been quiet for a moment. Your grandmother would have laughed. Sloane thought about Aldgate, about the particular architecture of his confidence, the way it was built entirely on the assumption that the people around him were categorically less than he was, not because of anything they had done or not done, but because of where they stood in relation to him. She had met that structure before. She had sat across a desk, from versions of it in graduate school, in her mother's doctor's office, in the offices of the hospital billing department, where she had spent an afternoon once trying to negotiate a payment plan for a charge that would have taken 8 months of her salary to clear. The structure was always the same, a certainty held without evidence that some people had more inherent claim on the world's seriousness than others. She had never found the best response to it to be anger. She had found the best response to be the one she'd always used, to simply keep being, quietly and without apology, exactly who she was. To know things, to do the work, to answer when spoken to, including in Japanese. She gave 2 weeks' notice at Haven and Hart on a Monday morning. The manager, a thin, careful man named Dov, who had hired her and who had never once asked her about her background, shook her hand and said he was sorry to lose her. "You're the best server I've had in 11 years, he said. "I mean that. I know you do," she said. "Thank you for meaning it." She worked her last 2 weeks the same way she had worked every shift before them, with the same attention, the same memory for details, the same stillness. She brought bread to table 4 without rosemary. She allowed the gentleman at 12 his ritual of deliberation. She did not disturb the woman by the window with her novel. On her last evening, a Saturday, the dining room was full. The kitchen was running long on the lamb, and Dov was managing a table that had arrived without a confirmed reservation. Sloane moved through it all with the ease of someone who has learned to let the noise of a room fall around her without touching her. She had learned that here, in this dining room, she had also learned it in a laboratory, a sitting with data that refused to cooperate, and in a hospital waiting room, and at a kitchen table in St. Louis, where her mother slept in the next room, and the bills were in a folder on the counter, and the future was not the shape it had been. She cashed out her last tips, changed out of her uniform, and walked out into a March night that had gone cold and clear while she wasn't paying attention. The city was loud and indifferent and exactly itself. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started walking. In 2 weeks, she would sit across a desk from Dr. Fontaine and begin learning a different vocabulary for the same problems she had always been drawn to. But that was not yet, for now she was standing on a Chicago street in March with the night air sharp against her face, knowing what she knew, which had always been enough.